We are back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And as always, I look forward to speaking with my next guest. He's a regular guest on the program. I always get so much out of our conversations. Richard Wolff is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. He is also an economist and an economic historian. He is a professor at a couple places. You know him by now. And his latest book is The Sicknesses of the System, about the pandemic. So without any further ado, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. Glad to be here. And I'm still reverberating from my reflections on the awarding of the Nobel Prize in economics this last week.
Well, why don't we talk about that? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, on the one hand, as my wife reminds me, where do my expectations come from? Alfred Nobel, after whom the prize is named, was an employer, a manufacturer of explosives, whose profits and growth over time came from the unique capacity he had to sell explosives to both sides, so that as they blew each other up and used up, they would have to reorder more explosives. They might have been killing themselves, but Mr. Nobel made a killing in more ways than one. So what am I expecting? They give prizes to economists every year. Actually, the original Nobel didn't have an economics prize. That was added later in the history of the prize. But it gets a lot of global attention, most of it carefully cleansing the story from any reflection on where the money comes from, that is the prize you get. If ever there were an example of money which has some blood dripping from it, here it is. But that's aside. That's one of those unpleasant things that the history of capitalism sanitizes so that we don't feel bad when we see this. This year's prize to three economists is absolutely in the tradition. These three economists do technical, empirical work. They compare one series of data to another. They subject it to the rigorous tests of statistical analysis in which they are specialists, and so on. The questions are narrow. The questions are small. What do I mean? Well, there is at least a third of the world today that confronts levels of abysmal poverty, disease, lack of opportunity, lack of education. And we have a capitalism 300 years old that has done nothing to end this situation, which isn't all that different from what it found 300 years ago in terms of its broad outlines. We have a system that has presided over an improvement in health, education, and welfare, but it had to be fought for by the working class against the active opposition of the employer class, which has now handled its defeat. You know, we don't have 16-hour days the way we did in the 18th and 19th century. We have only 8 to 10-hour days, and that is certainly progress. But if you look at that story, like every other, the progress took decades to achieve by often violent struggle of working people to reduce the working day. It was all done over the opposition and delay of the employer class, who now want us to give them credit for what has been advanced for the mass of people, as if they made it happen rather than fought it tooth and nail. Well, another third of the world is critical of capitalism. They express it in many different ways, some by calling themselves socialists or communists and all of that. others in their actions. As I speak to you today, I just finished taking a look at the excitement among the workers in the factories of the John Deere Corporation who went out on strike this morning. As I looked a few days ago at the workers at the Kellogg cereal company who went out on strike. And my friends in San Antonio just wrote to me about the musicians at the San Antonio Symphony who went out on strike, and so on. We're seeing a capitalism in extreme crisis. I mean, for example, central banks have printed more new money and thrown it into the economy than we've ever seen before in peacetime. I mean, this is extraordinary. We've never had a global economic crash occurring together with a global pandemic in which the leading capitalist countries have been notably failures at preparing for it, coping with it. None of these enormous issues ever interest the Nobel Committee. They don't know about the economics of alternative economic systems. They're not interested in those discussions or debates. It's really a small club of self-referential people who read each other's work, maybe, certainly nobody else does. They read each other's work and they celebrate the nuances, the advances, no doubt, that this small group of narrowly focused people do. But for those who may be watching or listening, who think of economics as it used to be thought of, as a broad inquiry into that part of life that involves producing and distributing the goods and services without which modern civilized life isn't possible, and how that, whatever way we get to produce and distribute, interacts with how we think and dream and dress and construct families and all the rest of life. If that's what you think economics is, and indeed that's what it once was, you will be sorely disappointed, not just by this year's Nobel Prize, but by a profession that has become so narrow, so unspeakably out of tune with the rest of the world's concerns, that they are surprising when you catch them, often after 2, maybe 3 martinis, and they moan into their drink why no one seems interested in what they do, not realizing that they are complementing the wisdom of the larger society.
Well, about the Nobel Prize and about central banks, it's funny that you mentioned both, because if I recall my history correctly, first of all, as you say, the economics Nobel, it's not a real Nobel Prize in that it wasn't, in the will of that explosives oligarch Alfred Nobel. A lot of people don't know it was created in 1968, and who funded it? A central bank, Sveriges Riksbank. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly. The central bank of, I can't remember, Switzerland, Sweden, I think. Sweden. Yeah. And so you have, basically, it's this sort of, I think of it as a vanity project for a subset of the economics profession. Let's get some of our friends who have access to a lot of capital to fund this thing, to pretend it's like the real Nobels so we can celebrate each other. But by the way, my favorite story about this year's Nobel, which is, I understand it was awarded to David Card was the only name I was already familiar with, for studying labor economics and causal relationships, I guess, for example, between the minimum wage and employment. My favorite was when NPR referred to it by saying the Nobel was awarded for the study of casual relationships, which was just a misplacement of 2 letters, but actually would have been much more interesting. I think a lot of people would have read that.
For sure.
So we have, I'm fascinated by this, this idea. I almost imagine economics, which at one point seems to have been a wide-ranging exploration of, how human beings interact and transact in their daily lives has become almost like the cartography division of, the starship capitalism, that they just sit there and map out different ways this thing could go, but they don't really question, first of all, are we really on a starship? And secondly, is this the best way to get from point A? You get what I'm trying to say. That it seemed,
It's amazingly narrow. It's amazingly inward turning. And it's part of the atrophy and the boredom and the disinterest. The students who come to the introductory class hoping to understand the economy, having grown up, to age 18, 19, whatever they are when they first begin, having sat around the dinner table and heard how important money was to mama and papa and the rest of the family. They know that this stuff matters. They've had to be disappointed that they couldn't get something they might have liked to buy or get a part-time job they might have liked to learn from. They've touched the economy in a million ways because there's no way to live without it. And they come in with all of the wonderful curiosity and interest in seeing the connections. And what they get is a narrowly defined course that resembles most engineering. How you fix a carburetor. You adjust the air and the gasoline inflow. And if you do it this way, you get this kind of a thrust. And if you do it that way, et cetera, et cetera. But what is a car and what is the meaning of an automobile and how does it change our lives and what's it got to do with the overwhelming pollution that threatens our lives? None of those questions are dealt with in the core curriculum. You're lucky if maybe one or two of the faculty teach a course on the sly as an extra, and you can maybe take it as a quote unquote elective. But the core material, well, here's two things that I learned. And I've been a professor of economics all my adult life in half a dozen different universities. The first thing I learned is a certain amount of humility because my students thought they were taking courses in how the economy works.
Right.
And they thought they were enrolling in a program in the department that would teach them. But of course it doesn't. It hasn't done that for at least half a century, probably more. What economics courses do is completely different. They teach you how to like capitalism. It's, of course, really, that's what it is. I was taught, by the way, just as a footnote again, I went to Harvard, Stanford, and Yale. Those are the only schools I ever attended. So I presumably got the best of what there is, or at least up there in the higher ranks, if you take this ranking seriously, which footnote I don't, but I know many do. Okay, so I was taught in my classes, and I'm surrounded all my life with colleagues who teach you that capitalism is efficient, that capitalism is growth-oriented, that capitalist competition is by far the best way to organize anything, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is not about how a system works, since the same people who teach it will admit most of the time that the economy that actually exists out there is several light years from that which we are teaching. But we can teach a kind of capitalism that is wonderfully efficient and the free market, all this make-believe. So the students who are smart learn after 2 or 3 semesters. Okay, I get it. Capitalism is really wonderful. I mean, you've been telling me this over and over again. But I like to learn, how is it that Walmart is so big and why my neighborhood department store is now empty and gathering cobwebs? What's that about? I'm interested in that. Oh, we have to tell our students, if you actually want to learn how the economy works, there is a second economics department in every university where you go to learn how it actually works. And that place is called the business school. No other discipline has two departments in every university. There aren't two history departments or two English departments or two biology departments. There's one, but not in economics. It had to create a double so that it could tell students who wanted to learn maybe how to start a business, how to run a business, what the whole issues are. There's a place for you. Go over there. It's much lower in prestige. We are, and then you get this highfalutin representation. We understand it. No, you don't understand it. You're afraid to have a program in understanding it, because if you actually believed that your goal was to understand the economy, then you would have to allow that you need to expose the student to those writers, thinkers who have analyzed the theory from the perspective of those who love it. But you would also have to teach them, how does it look for those who don't? Because otherwise you're going to get a lopsided, one-sided view. And I give that example to my students. If you were asked to analyze a family that lived up the road from you, and you knew there was a mother, a father, and two children, and you also knew that one of the children thought it was luck, wonderful luck, to have been born into such a wonderful family, while the other child thought that the family was a psychological basket case, right? If you were not crazy, you would interview both of those students, not just one of them, and then you would draw whatever conclusions made sense to you. And likewise, if you want to understand an economy, there's a literature of celebration. Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Marshall, Keynes, they all loved capitalism, and they all said so to their credit. But then there's a whole nother tradition, the one I'm interested in, called Marxism, where genius people, just as smart as those who loved it, didn't. And you know, if you step back and you think a minute, every system has its celebrants and its critics. And if you want to understand feudalism or slavery or anything else, you will read the critics, you'll read the defenders, and you'll draw your own conclusion. Well, you can count on the fingers of 2 or 3 people's hands the number of economics departments in this country that have any kind of sustained program or course offering in Marxian economics. You are already rare to have a single person in a faculty who will honestly say, I know something about it. And most of those will not teach it because they don't know that much, and they're not eager to get a reputation that might come along with teaching that course. So we've basically developed by now several generations of young people who've gone through economics training, majored in economics. It's a fairly popular major in colleges. They've gone on to be business leaders, journalists, politicians. So they articulate the economics they learn. And here's a scary thought. Maybe the grotesque incompetence of managing capitalism's constant crises has something to do with sanitizing the curriculum so the students never get to understand what has been figured out by the critics, who, of course, focus on the inequality, focus on the instability, focus on the injustices. If you don't criticize a system, it rots. And we're living in that rot.
You know, the one difference between, let's say, the family analogy you used, or even feudalism, and economics is that, of course, that economics, capitalist economics, if you will, presents itself as the science, as a kind of physics, right? That just as your body in motion tends to stay in motion until acted upon by an outside force, people do A, B, C. A quick anecdote, if I may. Yeah. So in a previous life, I was managing a big project for the United States Agency for International Development on healthcare financing and models in different countries. And when communism started to collapse in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, We had a lot of missions out there. And there I was, me of all people, commanding flotillas of academic economists from Berkeley and Harvard and Yale and everywhere else, sending them everywhere. And by the way, paying on my credit card and hoping to be reimbursed a later date for their travel. The president of MasterCard called me up and thanked me for the business. But I remember at one point we were in a communist country with one of these economists, and we were interviewing people in a village, and somebody said, well, you can't get access to the local doctor unless you give them something. So, it might be a chicken if it's for a checkup, it might be a cow if it's for a pregnancy or whatever. And the economist turned to me and see, it's fundamental human nature, even in communism, to develop markets. And I said, well, I think you could probably go back to Berkeley and find people who are under capitalism who are spontaneously collaborating or cooperating too. I mean, I think it's at least two-sided, isn't it? I said, no. What we're seeing is a force of nature at work. And that to me seems to be what economics is about nowadays, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it is historical nonsense. I mean, it would take an anthropologist maybe 10, maybe 11 minutes to give you 14,000 examples of societies that existed for centuries that had no markets. And by the way, the word market, it's a wonderful example. The word market has nothing to do with anything. It is a fetish in the economist's mind. The New York Times writes that capitalism is a market economy and the Soviet Union is a non-market economy. I have no idea what they're talking about. The word market means it's a place. That's how it starts. It's a place where people come to exchange things. Okay, that was going on in the Soviet Union from the first day in 1917 to the last day in 1989. I mean, the idea that they didn't have a market would have struck the people inside Russia, Soviet Russia, as a kind of bizarre craziness, number one. Number two, markets are not distinctive to capitalism. You remember slavery? In every major southern city in the United States, there's a place downtown called the Old Slave Market. Why? Because in the slave South, you bought and sold slaves. That's a market. And you bought and sold what the slaves helped to produce, cotton and so forth. So markets don't give you capitalism. Markets are consistent with slavery. We know that because there's a historical record. The same is true of feudalism and lots of other. So there's nothing uniquely defining capitalism by the presence of markets. It's complete, if you pardon my Spanish, bullshit. And it's only by its endless repetition that it has any currency at all, and by excluding the perspectives. Marx went out of his way in Capital to say, I am criticizing not the market. I am criticizing the organization of production. The whole first half of volume 1 of Capital is Marx taking us through, very sophisticated, why the exchange process is not where economies grow. They grow in the production process because one side of that process, the worker, produces more when he or she applies their brains and muscles to raw materials than they are paid by the other side, the employer, for doing so. In that moment, in production, growth, profit, development occurs. It doesn't occur in exchange, which is why Marx says, that's not my focus. Imagine then the bizarre critique of Marxism that the neoclassical, the mainstream economics uses. They look at Marx and they say, he didn't come up with an adequate theory of prices. Put aside whether he did or he didn't. I, for one, have published work showing that he did. That doesn't matter. But the point is, let's suppose he didn't. Well, the reason he didn't is that was not his object. His object, as he explains, was to take us away from the market, because the market, as he points out, is what attracted and mystified Adam Smith and Ricardo and the others. And he learned a lot from them. Marx was very respectful, much more respectful to them than the followers that they had later were of him. He was very respectful, but on this point, he begged to differ. He went in a different direction, and he explains why. And all of this is unknown to the folks, because again, they've never allowed anyone to teach in the university in this country. It's worse in this country than almost any European country, and many, many universities around the world in which Marxism as an alternative is taught to people, at least to some degree, because of the thought in the minds of people there who are by no means Marxists, that the lopsided education of the United States is a model to be avoided, not to be followed. And those who do follow, because there's a lot of money in it, you get grants from everybody and his brother around the world if you make an economics curriculum that matches that, particularly of the University of Chicago. And so we have a lot of those mimics out there. But anyone who has any independence long ago backed away from that, because they could see that this was naked ideological hustle and not anything. I mean, in the future, I'm sure that people will look back on the time after World War II, and the economics profession decided to become a business. And the way you become a successful business is you imitate that part of the university that gets lots of grants. And the part of the university that gets the grants are the physical sciences: physics, chemistry, mathematics, and biology. And economics said, okay, we're in danger of disappearing, becoming marginal, the way history did or anthropology did or we don't want to go in that direction. That's not getting the money from the university administration. So let's be as much like the natural sciences. That's why you're right on target, RJ. It is physics. It is laws like that. They want it mathematical. They want it impenetrable. They want people to look upon economists as people you have to listen to because they know all the science that we poor laypersons cannot hope at given our ignorance, to replicate. And they've used that to be right up there, having the ear of the president. And let's be clear, we've had 3 collapses of capitalism in the first 21 years of this century. The dot-com crisis in 2000, the subprime mortgage crisis in 2008, and now the COVID crisis in 2020. A staggering number of, out of those 3, 2 of them are the number 2 and number 3 worst crises in American capitalism history. What an amazing demonstration of incompetence. The profession didn't know it was coming. The profession had no plan, did not forewarn anybody, didn't know what to do, is flying by the seat of its pants. But don't worry, nobody in the club will say any of this. They will only beat each other up, have their same tired old debates. Is a little more government intervention good, or is a little less government intervention good? We will have the Keynesians a la Paul Krugman debating the conservatives a la libertarians or somebody else. This tired debate, now 100 years old and not one whit closer to resolution than it has ever been, continues to be the excitement for the small club. For the rest, they look on this little cabal with a mixture of astonishment and disgust, and above all, disinterest.
Yeah. Well, I'm not the scholar of Marxism you are, certainly, but if I recall, Karl Marx once said that he was not in the business of providing recipes for the diners or cook shops of the future. So I guess we're not either, but someday, if not now, Richard Wolff, I look forward to asking you what the economics cook shops of the future might look like. In other words, if we could, if you had the magic wand to, leaving aside the fact that we're materialists, may not believe in a magic wand, if you had the magic wand to transform the profession of economics, what would it look like?
Well, very briefly, and we do need to discuss it another time. I would say this, and I think your viewers would be interested. Most of my life, up until really 2 or 3, 4 years ago, the most I could hope to do in my public discussions, in my writing, was to begin to give the other side of an assessment of capitalism, the critical position. That's what Marx tried to do. And if I had to summarize what I've tried to do, well, it's tried to learn. Marx made mistakes. Things can be made better. But to continue his project of making a critical perspective. But starting 4 or 5 years ago, something happened that had never happened to me before. And I was born in the United States. I've lived here all my life, worked here all my life. People began in large numbers to say to me, you don't have to do that. We don't want to hear any more criticism of capitalism. You don't need to persuade us. We figured it out ourselves, or thank you, you've helped us see it, but we're beyond. Now we want to know what next. Where do we go? We're agreed. Capitalism is something that the human race can and should do better than. But where do we go? What do we do? So for me, the workshops of the future, the economics workshops, that's their task. Answer that question. You know, in feudalism, people figured out a way to get beyond the limits here would be to try to go in these directions, one of which is the capitalism that emerged. Likewise, in slavery, they didn't just say, let's be free. They had very different ideas of how that freedom would be accomplished, what that freedom would entail, what limits on that freedom should exist. And one of those is what emerges out of each slavery as it dissolves. Well, that's what we ought to be doing. That's what Nobel ought to be giving prizes for. People with interesting ideas of alternative ways that they can at least point to, if we do this, these problems of capitalism can be alleviated or at least reduced in their horror. Let's try this. And you know me, I'm an advocate of worker co-ops, a transformation of the workplace that democratizes it, because I see that as a clear line of where to go beyond capitalism. The Nobel Committee has never recognized that there is an alternative to capitalism, that there are economists around the world working on it, and I can assure you there are, that there are practical, empirical experiments in that kind of work, many of which have existed for decades and therefore offer the opportunity for empirical study. The Nobel Prize could be less interested. And in that, it is exactly like the academic profession of economics in the United States, which thinks that capitalism is the end of human history, the most preposterous proposition and the most arrogant you can imagine, having learned nothing from the Egyptian pharaoh who thought they had the end of history, or the Roman Empire, or the British Empire, or, Lord help us, the neocons who cannot envision the end of the American economy and empire either.
Well, on that note, I know you have to go. So, Richard Wolff, I think we have a topic for our next discussion. And as always, great talking with you. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you. And I hope I didn't overspeak myself, but you did touch the nerve, as you can probably see.
And not at all.
All right.
Thank you again. And we'll be right
Bye-bye.
back. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.